African Americans and Africans have a social and cultural philosophy. And it's key that we draw from that in terms of building power for our people. The key thing about the United States is it's a nation of nations under the control of Anglo-Saxon Protestants who run the country, you know. And so all whites who come from whether Eastern Europe or Western Europe, whether French, German, or whatever, they got to learn how to speak English. They may hold on to Catholicism, but it's mainly the Anglo-Saxon Protestant view that is going to dominate them. And in the case of other ethnic groups, they also make up groupings that we can call nations. And within the United States, the African American is a nation within a nation. We're not a nation state, but we're a nation within a nation. One of the key things about Harold Cruz's writings that made it a classic was that he identified two streams in Black political struggle. One was integration, the other was Black nationalism. And for the integration stream, he particularly identified Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King. For the nationalist stream, he identified Martin R. Delaney, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X. Now that revelation was one of the things that made that book a classic, because he's right, there are these two streams. But it's really more complicated than he thought it was, because I've never seen Cruz do an analysis of the nationalism of the masses. He did an analysis of the nationalism, particularly expressed through the arts movement, and the nationalism coming out of some of our leading thinkers like Delaney or Douglass and others, or Malcolm. But he didn't look at the nationalism that comes out of the grassroots. And this is what a lot of us have missed. In other words, a Martin R. Delaney, a Marcus Garvey, a Malcolm X at one point, because he shifts later, you could call them nation state nationalists. That is, they wanted Blacks to form a nation state. Nation are a people with a common culture. But a state is where you have a government. You usually have some kind of head, whatever you call them. You usually have a series of things, and a state usually is able to protect itself, usually some kind of military, some kind of police. Often an oppressive state to protect the leaders of the nation against their own people. But the point is, that wing that he described would be described as nation state nationalists. And he's right, we have a wing of integrationists, and that is the wing he's describing when he talks about the bankrupt Black bourgeoisie. But what about the masses of Black folks? The majority of Blacks in this country, not all, but a majority, forged out of enslavement, created a culture, African-based with new elements, and the intrusion of the slave mentalities into it, but largely standing on fundamental African principles with new ones added. And those African principles are the principles of spirit, the principles of humanism, the principles of democracy, the principles of communalism, and many others. And the new additions, race consciousness, Pan-Africanism. This is my specialty. I spend as much time on my people as I do Africa, in fact, more. Because this is where I live. These are my folks. Africa is mine too. I love Africa, love African people. But our people here, special for me. as they are for all people all over the world, whatever group you come from. So the African and enslavement creates a culture and an art form, and this is the basis for us seeing ourselves as a nation. Africans and enslavement would describe those who did not embrace their culture as no nation blacks. They had various other terms for them, but no nation. And saw themselves as making up a nation within a nation. And the primary basis for this nationality is, of course, the color of our skin, but it's whether you identify with it, and that's our culture. And the principles that drive African American or New African culture are fundamentally the same as those that drive African culture. And the two that I'm going to focus on in a minute are spirit and humanism, two fundamental principles. And notice when the sisters were talking about what got them off of alcoholism, spirit and family, and the expectation that they had of themselves of being good people and knowing that they had departed from that humanism. You hear me? So in talking about the link between the philosophy and economic development, the philosophy and culture, it's to understand that that philosophy is the deepest expression of the culture, both African and African American. So the contradiction in Cruz's analysis of the nationalism was that while he's correct in identifying nation-state nationalism and integration, he doesn't really provide an analysis of grassroots nationalism. And what I would call this nationalism is a nationalism centered on our people. We don't have the land, to base the analysis or identification with, even though some of us will identify with Africa as the place we should go. And if we choose to do that, that's right. That's good. And there's some of us who would identify with land in the South. We'd like to have a nation in the South. If you can pull that off, good, that's fine. But the reality is, for the majority of our people, their nationalism is based on their identification with their people and with their culture. And so they don't see where it's possible for them to go to Africa. A lot of them don't want to, but there are periods of time where a lot did, and very few see how we're going to seize us some states in the South. Maybe that will happen in the future. But the majority of Black people are very practical and smart, and they're not going to make moves unless they can see daylight at the end of the tunnel, where they can see how it's going to work, that it can happen. And so we identify around our people, around our culture. So if you take a Martin Luther King, for example, he's listed by Cruz as being a part of the assimilated integrated group, that is the camp of integration. And there's some reason for saying that, because King would often talk about integration. By the end of his life, he said it was like a burning house, and that he wasn't any longer going to encourage Black people to do that. But the reality is, King came out of a Black family, a Black community, a Black church, and Black culture. Most of his advisors were Black. He had a few whites, but most of his advisors were Black, the people who helped him shape speeches, who he bounced ideas off of. He had a guy named Stanley Levison, who was a Marxist who worked with Ella Baker, who was somebody who he got some ideas from, but his principal advisors were Black. This was a point that Manu Ampin made when we were talking about the radical Martin Luther King. So he was a reflection of Black culture, now Black middle class culture. And he wasn't one of those bankrupt Blacks who had abandoned his people. He left his people, you know. He wasn't as deep of an intellectual when it came to history and stuff as Malcolm was, but he was better read than people think. And what you have noted with Menu Ampin's analysis of him, he had a close connection to Africa. He was at the independence ceremonies of Kwame Nkrumah, Azikiwe. He was constantly in correspondence with liberation movement leaders and supported armed struggles, including Vietnam. Because he saw, this was Menu Ampin's point, he saw that in those places it was practical for them to do that. That's how the grassroots views things. Practical, you know what I mean? Grassroots into self-defense, but they don't advertise their self-defense. They're too smart to do that, you know what I mean? Bust in on them and see what happens. Mr. Oscar Wright, who I organized with, I was referring to before, in Buffer, Black United Front for Educational Reform, come out of Mississippi. He's 96 years old, still in good shape. But Mr. Wright, we're out there organizing, going door to door. Mr. Wright always carried him a big old pocket knife. When a bulldog came after him, he just flipped it out. And this Negro that was going to let him eat him up started begging him not to kill his dog, called him off. That was Mr. Oscar Wright. You ain't running around advertising that. You know what I mean? That's the grassroots. You hear me? So when we're talking about a philosophy that is grounded in our culture, when we did the discipline shifted state, we were also putting the department in a position of pursuing an aggressive posture of Black nationalism. And that is also what the grassroots is about. They just need to be more conscious of Africa and work on some of those negatives. But basically, that's what the culture is that they've created. And when we get into consumer cooperatives, you're going to see that Black tastes and stuff are largely also culturally driven. And there's some key things about Black taste that come out of African and African-American culture. If you want to be successful in setting up a business, you better understand the psychology of the people that you're setting up a business to gain support from. You better minister to those cultural needs, those psychological needs, and of course, those economic needs.